Sean Mitchell. He's an associate professor of anthropology at Rutgers University in Newark. Thank you for joining us on the program. Sean, this is not the first time that these traditional Afro-Brazilian communities have had to sacrifice their territories for the launch center. What are they facing now? More of the same, more forced relocations?
Yeah, most likely. I mean, the base was built in the 1980s. I wrote a book about this base and the long history of conflicts around it. The base was built in the 1980s, and more than 300 families were forcibly removed from their land, and more families likely face the same.
What constitutional rights do they have, if any?
They do. Brazil's 1988 constitution requires that the state grant inalienable land rights to remanescentes das comunidades dos quilombos. That's these slave-descended communities that these communities are part of. Yet these communities have never been emitted constitutionally required land title. And so that's a big part of the struggle that's going on there now.
So what promises has the Brazilian government made to them, I mean, if any?
Yeah, I mean, there have been many promises made over the years, and the communities that still live on coastal land, many of them have been slated for relocation since the base was built in the 1980s, and for a variety of reasons, including, frankly, low funding, which is part of the story today, low funding to the Brazilian space program, and also because of their own resistance and their constitutional rights, they've been able to retain that land. And so there have been many promises made by the Brazilian government. The current federal government in Brazil is very hostile to the rights of minorities and other marginalized groups in Brazil. And so the situation has worsened significantly under the current government of Jair Bolsonaro and the government of Donald Trump as well, which is, also not particularly friendly to the interests of communities such as the Quilombolas.
We heard in that piece before I came to you that there some supporters of the accord say it will not only help Brazil's space program and help the region's traditional Afro-Brazilian communities, but in what way? I mean, do you believe those claims that it actually will benefit these communities?
It's certainly not going to benefit the local communities that, have a way of life. They have great sea for fishing and excellent land to farm. People do not want to leave because they, saw what happened to those who were removed in the 1980s and their lives got much worse. And there are no indications that anything will be better this time. In terms of putting money into the local economy, undoubtedly there will be some of that. However, there'd be a lot more money put into the local economy if the Brazilian government invested in its own space program. This is really a case of the Brazilian government abandoning its own projects for space development. I mean, the existing base has more than enough land for that, but it's really been abandoned by the Brazilian government and instead bringing in the United States, which will be much less of a kind of net gain to the region and indeed to Brazil than would be the case if Brazil were actually to resume investment itself in developing the base that already exists.
But why has it abandoned its own space program if it's not going to benefit under this program with the U.S. in the way that it possibly should?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's money that will come in. I mean, the idea is to harness the gravitational advantages of this equatorial site for satellite launch. And, part of it is geopolitics. The current government of Jair Bolsonaro is turning away under the Workers' Party governments. Brazil really did a lot to chart a more independent foreign policy. And the current Bolsonaro government is putting Brazilian policy much more squarely into the orbit of the United States. And this policy is very much consistent with that.
President Bolsonaro is a strong supporter of this agreement, but when he was a congressman 2 decades ago, he actually was opposed to a similar accord. Why the turnaround?
That's correct. That's a very, very good question. There was a very similar accord that was signed under President Fernando Henrique Cardoso and Bill Clinton 2 decades ago, more than 2 decades ago. And Bolsonaro, then a congressman, was a fierce opponent of that accord, mostly on nationalist grounds, that he saw the accord as compromising Brazilian sovereignty and technological development. And he's really retreated from that position today. And I think, again, it's his desire to really create a subordinate Brazilian space and technological development policy to the United States. Back in the 1990s, that was a period when there was relatively broader-based support for a more independent policy.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. We're completely out of time. Sean Mitchell joining us from Newark. Thank you, Sean.